our guest speaker, Professor Dr. Robin Bates from St. Mary's University in Maryland. So before I give him the floor, I'll just say a few things about him. So he's been teaching for the past 35 years at St. Mary's. He writes a daily blog entitled Better Living Through Beowulf, How Great Literature Can Change Your Life. So if you're interested, it's a daily blog, so you can check it. He's also written a book called How Beowulf Can Save America, an Epic Hero's Guide to Defeating the Politics of Rage. Also an enticing title. He's had, so this is not his first time in Slovenia. He's had 2 Fulbright fellowships to Slovenia. And the first time he was here, it was still Yugoslavia. So it was quite some years ago. But he's definitely not new to this part of the world. Over the past, I don't know how many years, but he's been running an exchange program between St. Mary's and Slovenia, so the University of Ljubljana. So you probably, some of you might have actually met him or might in the future. Okay, so enough from me. I give the floor to you now.
Dobro jutro. Govorim samo malo slovensko. Jezik je zelo težko za Američani, and therefore I am going to lecture in English. I have fond memories of Slovenia and before then Yugoslavia. I remember having an office upstairs down the hall. The first time I was here, I shared an office with Janus Stanonik. He's a Melville scholar.
Some of us still remember him.
No, I still remember students coming by with their. Do you still have? They had the little zvezki, and Professor Stanonik would say, "Tell me about Washington Irving," and then the student would say something about Washington Irving, and then he said, "You get a 7." And you would write a 7. I said, wow, that is so different than the way we
It's all electronic now. We don't have those anymore.
No longer hard. I remember that. So as you perhaps could tell, I have some very close friends who are the faculty here. I have at least one student, Jonathan, who was at St. Mary's last semester. So Laura asked me to teach, to talk about American economics. And even though I'm not an economist, this is a question, this is a subject that interests me a great deal. And I saw your questions. The questions were odlično. Excellent questions. So I've tried to answer all the questions in my talk, but if I don't touch your question, or if you have other questions, I'm going to leave time afterwards so you'll be able to ask those questions. So please don't be shy, and I will. So I talked. I mean, perhaps all countries are crazy, but America has a particular kind of craziness. So I entitled this talk, Haunted Calvinists, Rapacious Slave Owners, Crazy Pioneers, and Starstruck Immigrants, the Cultural Foundations of American Economics. So to understand why American economics is the way it is, it's very useful to look at some history. And I have some idea of how strange American economics should appear to Slovenians, because I've talked with, I've had many Slovenian students live with us over the years, and they say, I don't understand this or this or this aspect, and so I'll try to speak with that in mind. One thing Slovenians have a difficult time understanding is why American students, college students, graduate from college tens of thousands of dollars in debt. That's hard to understand, right? Why is it that not everybody has access to health care? Why do people sometimes lose their houses because they have such high health care costs? why is there seem to be all this anti-government sentiment that you hear in politics? So those are some, and there are historical reasons for all of that. So I'll try to give you some of the background to that. So the first economic fact. So how has America? In fact, I'll give you. I had a Chinese student once, and he said, in the brief but glorious history of the United States. I said, yes, I guess from a Chinese point of view, we have a very brief, history. And so how did it happen? Well, the first economic fact, they kind of laid the groundwork for America's phenomenal economic success in the 19th and 20th centuries, is that disease wiped out most of the, or at least a large percentage of the Native American population. I'm sure you've all heard about that, how you had a whole hemisphere which was not inoculated against certain diseases. And so this meant that when European settlers came to the United States, they were coming to a country which looked like, a few people lived here, but it looked like it was like there for the taking. If you'd gone to India, if they'd gone to China, that was not the same situation. In the United States, so it just looked like there was kind of free land to whoever wanted to have it. A few Native Americans, but because of steel, because of gunpowder, they could be militarily overwhelmed. So that's the first economic kind of fact about America. It's always useful to keep in mind. I know that, just to give you a specific example, in the part of Maryland where I live, English settlers came in and they actually bought land. There was Piscataway for the Piscataway tribe. But the Piscataway tribe was in danger of being overrun by the Rappahannock tribe. And what had happened was when the illnesses came through, they hit some tribes more than other tribes, and so suddenly the whole balances of power were thrown off, so there were all these wars going on between the different Indian tribes, which then the European settlers came in and took advantage of. Same thing happened, versions of the same thing happened in South America as well, with the Spanish and the Portuguese. So it's useful. Think of two kinds of settlers. Maybe there are two kinds of settlers. Two categories, and one were religious settlers, the Puritans especially, the Pilgrims, as we call them. These were, and these people who wanted to come to the New World and build the kingdom of God on earth, or as they call it, a city on the hill. And so they came, and they were prepared to work hard, and as they say, build God's kingdom. And then the second kind are settlers who wanted to get rich. So when they talk about the American dream, those are the two sides of the American dream. Freedom of ideas or religion, and chance to make a lot of money. So I want to talk about each of those impulses kind of shaped America in distinctive ways. So let me start with the Pilgrims. We have this holiday of Thanksgiving. It's my favorite American holiday, which were brought to by the Pilgrims. I ran into someone the other day. Some Brit was saying, well, we also want to celebrate Thanksgiving because Thanksgiving we got these people out of England and into America. We didn't have to deal with them. So these were Calvinists, if you know what Calvin is, kind of followers of Calvin. And but they really, even though there weren't that many of them, they really shaped in certain ways what it means to be an American. So the Pilgrims believed in predestination. If you've kind of heard that notion, this notion of when you were born, you already are predestined if you're going to heaven or if you're going to hell. Because if God knows everything, then he knows ahead of time where you're going. And there's nothing you can do to stop that. And I'm getting to a little religious history here, a little theology here, because it's useful to understand, because it becomes it plays an important role in economics. So, okay, so how do you know? So hellfire was such a frightening prospect that you had to have some assurance that you were one of the elect, one of the people who was going to heaven, as opposed to one of the people who was going to hell. So how do you know if you're one of the elect? Well, maybe what you do is you look around you look at your life and you say, well, does it look like God is favoring me, or does it look like God is not favoring me? And one thing you looked at was how economically well you were doing. So if I'm doing well economically, then that must be I am one of the elect. And if I'm poor, that must mean I'm one of the damned. So suddenly, but then you say, well, I'm going to try to make sure that I'm one of the elect by doing very well economically. And so these people became obsessed with doing well economically. And so it's not just that they wanted to be rich, that's these guys right here, but they wanted to be rich because if they were rich, that means that they were going to heaven. I know that sounds it doesn't sound very religious, right? or very Christian for that matter. But like, so being rich is a sign that you are in God's riches. So suddenly, when you are trying to make money, it's like you've got the fear of hell behind you. And we no longer, okay, we still have something which is called prosperity theology. A lot of Americans believe in prosperity theology. If God, a lot of them are Trump supporters. I know I have a brother-in-law who is a prosperity theology person. They believe that if you believe in God, God will rain riches down upon you. And that people who are poor, that's because God doesn't like them. And but even people who don't believe in Calvinism, or who are not Christian fundamentalists, somehow believe that if you don't work, or if you don't work hard, you are sinful. So there's this kind of what they call the American work ethic is connected with the Pilgrims. My wife took a trip to Africa a few years ago to the Gambia, and the Gambians were saying, Americans, they are crazy. They work so hard, it makes no sense. I had a brother, I'll give you another example. He was a computer software engineer, and when his company finally said they saw people working too hard, my brother had a heart attack at 48. He recovered, but it was because of how hard he was working. And the company said, okay, no one is allowed to work more than 60 hours a week. How does that sound? And people were saying, oh, thank God. I only have to work 60 hours a week. Okay, so but some of that crazy American kind of work impulse, we can trace back to that. Okay, the settlers. Now, all the other people, they came over to make money. And they didn't want to make money by having to work themselves. They wanted other people to work for me. And I know a lot of you ask questions about slaves and indentured servants, and who do you get to work for you? So I'm going to take you kind of through a little bit of that and show you the economics of how that worked out. So the first plan was, well, we will turn the Indians into slaves. Okay, so that was, we come over here, we get them to work for us, we make lots of money, and then we go back to Italy, to England or to France or to Spain, wherever it is, and with lots of money. That was the plan. First of all, Indians were dying because of these diseases, so that was the first problem. The second problem, was that Indians could just kind of run away into the rest of America. So that plan didn't work out very well. So then they started trying, indentured servants, and these were people who had been were guilty of crimes. If any of you have read the Daniel Defoe's novel about Moll Flanders, Moll Flanders is an indentured servant. That's how she comes to America. And so often they were contracted to work for 7 years, and then they would get their own freedom. So there was a prospect of freedom there for a while. And but when you had more colonies, and the colonies were not a country then, you just had individual colonies, sometimes run by different countries. An indentured servant, being white, looking like other Europeans, could run away too. Just run away, so there was not a way to hold on to them. So almost inevitably, they went to Plan B, Plan C, third plan, and that was African slaves. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the. There's a lot of study has been done on the economics of slavery and why America really. What have you asked this question? America owes a lot of its wealth to slavery. America was built on the back of Africans, basically. A lot of American prosperity can be linked to forced labor from Africa. Not everybody wants to admit that, but this is, economists say that is in fact the case. So, all right, I'll give you just a couple of economic things here. Put yourself in the position of a slave trader, first of all. Okay, there are two ways you can bring slaves over. You buy slaves from Africa, often they're prisoners of wars going on in Africa, so you buy your slaves in Africa. You can either put as many people as possible into a slave ship, which means that there's going to be a certain number of deaths. The conditions, just packed in like sardines in a can, and or you can be more humane and you can have fewer but better conditions. So which way makes more economic sense? And both ways were tried. And the way that the marketplace works is whichever way makes you the highest profit is what you are going to do. Not what is more humane. Guess which one won? Unfortunately, the first one won. It made more economic sense to pack it as full as you could, your slave ship. The people who died, you would just throw overboard. Sharks would, follow the ship all the way across the ocean, for the dead bodies that got thrown out. You could tell a slave ship was coming into harbor 3 days before it arrived because the smell was so bad that, there it was. The worst kind of people worked on board slave ships. Nobody who had any other option would work there. But okay, there's always somebody who needs a job. So that's how the economics work. They were very careful to break up tribes, so you never had two people from the same tribe kind of sold together. So that allowed them to keep people from. And then what could they do? They couldn't run off because they weren't Indians. They couldn't blend with the population. So basically, America evolved to a slave system, and the slave system lasted up until the Civil War of 1860. There's some people who wonder whether, would slavery have gone away on its own? Perhaps it would have, but probably not for a long, long time. When I think as much as a third of the economic gross national product was invested in slavery. It wasn't only the South which depended on slavery, it was the North that depended on slavery because the North depended on the cheap cotton, that was coming from the South, up north. So everybody, basically, the whole country, even states which didn't have slavery, had an investment in slavery. So it really is, it's America's, well, I don't know, if taking land away from Native Americans is our first original sin, slavery is our second original sin. But that was a sin which has gone so deep into, so much a part of us that we've never escaped. There are still effects of slavery existing with us today, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So that's how kind of how slavery works. I was raised in the, I'll tell you a little bit about that later. I'm from the state of Tennessee. Maybe you've heard of Tennessee because we're famous for country music. The country music capital of the Music City, USA. I grew up 80 miles from Nashville, Tennessee. But when I was growing up, we still had segregation, and I'll tell you about. I'll tell you about that now. So, and this, one of you asked a question about this as well. So in 1861, we had the bloodiest war of the 19th century, the American Civil War, and it was about slavery. People say it was about other things, but it was about slavery. When you have that kind of contradiction, when you have in your Declaration of Independence, you say all men are created equal. If you're a slave, you read that, you know what it says. If you're a woman and you read that, you know what it says. I mean, that is such an inspirational document that no matter how far off we have gotten away from our original ideals, people always come back to that. Everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson, the document that comes out of the Enlightenment. So we had the Civil War, and slavery was ended. So 1865, slavery was. Someone asked what happened to the slaves. So for a while, it looked like everything was going to be okay. Slaves were promised 40 acres and a mule. If you've seen, I don't know, Gone with the Wind, they talk a little bit about that, or very racist terms. But there were federal troops in the South who enforced, made sure that the slaves would not be, sent back into slavery. That only lasted for about 20 years, and then in 20 years there was a program of systematic terrorism. There were these terrorist groups, the most prominent of which was the KKK. You've heard of the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan. And basically, the whole purpose of the KKK was to terrorize African Americans. And a whole system of segregation was instituted, where you had two societies. So you no longer had slavery, but you did have this two-tier system. If you read Mark Twain, when he was writing Huckleberry Finn, he was taking a trip down the Mississippi. He was going to relive his piloting days when he was a pilot, as a Mississippi pilot. And as he came south, he got more and more depressed because he realized that this bloody war, which had been fought to end slavery, that slavery, a form of slavery, was being reinstituted at that time. And a lot of Huckleberry Finn comes out of his anger and his despair over what was happening. So even though it seems like a light book, there are all kinds of ways in which you can see his anger, especially for those of you who know Huckleberry Finn. When Tom Sawyer, at the end of the book, it's a very controversial end of the book. Some people think it's don't know why Mark Twain ended the book the way he did, but when Tom Sawyer says, "Well, Jim, let's pretend you're a slave or a prisoner, and we'll rescue you." That's almost like a way of saying you're free, but you're not really free. Or let's just play around with that. Okay, so and so this system of segregation lasted up until in the 1960s. And then there were Martin Luther King, and there were the Civil Rights Movement. And I was a plaintiff in a case. That means I was one of the people bringing suit. I was only 11 years old at that time. But in my town, 4 black families and 4 white families got together, and they sued the local Board of Education for continuing to be segregated. And so I'm in the history books. And we won. And so all the schools had to be segregated. But that happened when I was 12 years old. The first African-American student came to my class when I was 12 years old. So, okay, so major advances happened then, you know. Some people argue, however, we still have some people argue that we have a continuation of slavery in a large number of African-American, especially African-American men who are in the prison system. We have, let's see, I have the number here, I think about 3 million African-American men are in the prison system, often for 2.3 million. And that's a third of the prison population are African-American. Many of them for very low-level drug offenses. You know, they're caught. Whites who do the same things don't get the same kind of punishment as blacks. So the legacy of slavery lives on in various ways, and we're still wrestling with that. So that's the kind of the role that that's played. Now, if you were an immigrant, say, a Slovenian immigrant coming to, and many of the immigrants, I'm going to start talking about these immigrants. So a lot of immigrants, we would have waves of immigrants from different countries. You know, waves of immigrants from Ireland, especially after the potato famine, the great potato famine, or waves from Italy, waves from Russian Jews, with the whole, you know, with the pogroms that were going on in the late 19th century. So a lot of these people came over after we had slavery had ended. But here's the thing: if you were an immigrant and you came to this country, you knew the moment you stepped off the boat that you were not on the bottom. You know, usually when you're an immigrant, you come to another country, you're at the very bottom of the scale. You always knew you were superior to someone else. And this is one of the noxious legacies of slavery. You could always look down and say, well, at least I'm not African, or I'm not African American, or they had worse words for that. So even if you're an Irish, the Irish, this is going back to slavery times, when the Irish came over, the Irish were treated worse than slaves. And that makes sense when you think about it. You know, you don't treat a slave bad for the same reason you don't treat your horse bad. Right? You have an investment in your slave. Irish, they actually were often called wage slaves because you didn't have to pay them benefits, you didn't have to take care of their health. You just use them. You use them to build canals. You use them and then when they died, and you just brought in more. Same way with the Chinese. The Chinese, who are largely responsible for building the Trans-Pacific, you know, the railway, died like flies building that. But they were, you know, so in fact, when Northerners complained about Southern slavery, the Southerners would always say, "You hypocrites, you have wage slaves." So, but one thing that even if you were Irish, you would come in and you would say, at least I'm not there. At least I own myself. And so this, we have today, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you can't characterize any minority group, but when I look at Fox News, you know, the very right-wing Fox News, and there are people who are attacking immigrants, and some of the people attacking immigrants are Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity. Irish names, right? And I'm thinking, you know, and when Donald Trump says, we don't want people from, can I say, shithole countries coming here, and Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity say, right on. And I'm thinking, that 19th century, Ireland was a shithole country. But they would always say, but we're white. And this is why whiteness became such an important marker and continues to be that important marker in all kinds of economic ways today. So if you're a Slovenian, you're coming to Cleveland, you're coming to work in the the coal mines, or around Cleveland, the Appalachian. So, and conditions are horrific, right? Black lung disease. I mean, just to survive is a victory at all. But even so, as badly as you are treated, you can always say, "I'm not like them." And this sense of identity, of developing a certain kind of pride against somebody, that's not a good kind of pride to have, but but it continues to have all kinds of implications in the way that America goes today. All right, so let's talk about these immigrants. There was a time, if America's wealth is in part because of African slavery, the other aspect of America's wealth is immigration. There's no doubt about it. Immigrants made America wealthy. As of course, we're all immigrants, but waves of immigrants have always kind of re-energized the American economics. And this is something, you of course in Europe, you're kind of grappling with Syrian refugees, with people coming up from Africa, and all those kind of things. And you're seeing the resurgence of right-wing parties. I haven't been following Slovenia quite that closely, so I don't know if you're having this resurgent nationalism in Slovenia. Oh, okay, people are nodding yes. But certainly we're seeing in Germany and France, very badly in Poland, right, and in Hungary. People who, and we're seeing that with Donald Trump. I mean, that's more than anything else, he rose to popularity on his anti-immigrant immigrant thing. Anybody who knows anything knows that you're hurting yourself when you cut off immigrants. Certainly that's true in the United States. Immigration is so large, there have been times when we've been able to say, there are more Poles in Chicago than there are in Warsaw. There are more Slovenes in Cleveland than there were in Ljubljana. That's no longer true, but it was true for a little while. There are more Irish in Boston than there are in Dublin. More Jews in New York than in Tel Aviv. So, okay, we can't say that about Chinese in San Francisco because China always wins any number competition. But the number of the large Chinese American population in San Francisco, or Germans. Germans are just spread throughout the Midwest, especially in Wisconsin. Scandinavians flock to Minnesota and North Dakota and South Dakota. So these are, there's a huge population of Somalis in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. A huge population of Laotians in Detroit. So you have these often coming in and taking the jobs that Americans won't do, working in the packing industry, that's the slaughter industry. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, is all about, trying to remember, I think Polish, I can't remember the ethnicity. Lithuanian, yes, right. And you know how, you just know how awful the conditions were in the packing industry, in construction industry, in the house-cleaning industry, in caretaking. Number of Latin American caretakers, people taking care of your grandmother, because you can't afford to pay a lot, but you can afford to pay a little housekeeping in the hotels. Donald Trump is constantly hiring these people. This is one of the many ironies for at Mar-a-Lago. He hires non-unionized immigrant labor that he can get away with. So, friends, the hypocrisy runs very deep. They always talk about immigrants who have contributed. I mean, the most famous example is Steve Jobs is Syrian, born Syrian Muslims, and there's here, carrying around his work. One of you asked, and I love this question, did different immigrant groups have different experiences in the United States? And this is true, true as well. There's lots of theories. I'll just give you a couple of theories of why. Why does one immigrant group do so well and do better? So in the early 20th century, we call it the model minority. You want all minorities to act this way, the model minority, or minorities who had actually been successful in the United States. And the model minority were the Jews, Russian Jews. You say, well, why? Why did they do so well and others didn't do so well? Well, the reason, or at least one explanation which has been given, is that they are a text-based religion. The Torah, they're used to kind of interpreting the Torah. At a time when America was moving from industrial to, it actually needed bookkeepers, you needed managers, you needed people who could understand large figures. And so people who, and in fact, Jews flooded into the universities. You might be interested in this. Universities in the early part of the 20th century had quotas on the number of Jews who could come in because they were afraid that Jews would just fill up all the classes and basically change the culture of these universities. So there are these special rules, kind of cutting back on Jews. So that may explain why they did so well. Okay, right now the model minority is Asian Americans. Asian Americans are doing very, very well. In fact, they're starting to say, I don't know, if you just went on merit alone, you could fill up the entire California university system with nothing but Asian Americans. And once again, people say, God, we need some non-Asians. So why are Asian Americans doing so well? That's a good question. A couple of different theories. First of all, because of these extended, very family-oriented systems, and which means that if you come and you say open up all these say Korean or Chinese, especially Korean grocery stores are always opening up in major cities, in Los Angeles and New York and things like that. Well, you bring your whole family in, you don't pay anybody anything. They all work for the family concerned. And you're able to save a lot of money because you're not paying other people, right? So, there's I don't know if you come across the work of Malcolm Gladwell. He studied immigrants. He says sometimes, depending on where you come from, there are different patterns of work which continue on. So Gladwell also talks about how people from rice cultures do better in America than people from potato cultures. And think about that. When you're growing potatoes, say in Ireland, something like that, you have on seasons and off seasons. Some seasons are very busy and other seasons, well, it's winter time. They're off seasons. So whereas in rice culture, to raise rice, you have to work on rice all the time. So there's a whole different work ethic connected with rice cultures than there is with potato cultures. So maybe that's why the Asian Americans are doing as well, because they come from a rice culture. There are other reasons, kind of given, but it's an interesting question, isn't it? Why would some national? Now Slovenians, I haven't done any studies of Slovenians. I'm just trying to think. I know more about Serbians and Croatians than Slovenians, but I mean they really sort of marked the culture of Cleveland for quite a while. They were kind of a lower middle class, I suppose, is where Slovenians kind of fit in the American kind of hierarchy. I mean, some have done very well. Members of all the groups have done very well, but I'm talking about in kind of generalizing in a kind of larger group than that. All right, now I'm going to talk. So let's see, starstruck immigrants. Now I'm going to talk about crazy pioneers. Okay. Think about it this way. So say you're Slovenian, and you're still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Your life is hard. Slovenia. You're working on a living on the, in kind of mountain land, which isn't all that great. You have your little plot of land. So what would it take for you to leave that behind and go to America? That's not for everybody, right? There are some people who prefer the devil you know than the devil you don't know. The life you know rather than the life you don't know. The people who go to America are the dreamers. They're the risk takers. They're the people who are willing to, throw a cast of dice and then follow wherever the dice come down. And so a significant number of the immigrants who come to America are those people. Maybe it's not brother number one who's the responsible one. Maybe it's brother number two, who's always been in brother number one's shadow and now wants to make his own life. And I don't know, perhaps you yourselves even have stories of people in the family who stayed in Slovenia versus who went to the United States or Canada or Australia or something like that. So there is. Just as you have a Calvinist work ethic into the American identity, you also have a risk-taking element in the American identity. So the pioneers, I mean, a lot of those people were absolutely crazy. They would just kind of get into a wagon, sell all their goods away, and they would go for the great gold rush of 1849. There's gold in California. Okay, I don't know anything about anything, but I'm going to go out and become rich in California. All kinds of stories of people dying in the gold rush on the way there, or being attacked by Indians, or still some effective Indian tribes in 1849, or the Alaska gold rush. Same thing. I was just reading a book. Do any of you know Loris Ingalls Wilder's books, the Little House books, The Little House on the Prairie? Yeah. Some of you are nodding. Yeah, Loris Ingalls Wilder was one of these pioneer families. Her family was crazy. They would go off to there's cheap land in North Dakota. North Dakota is really cold in the winter, really hot and dry in the summer. They would go off to North Dakota. They would break their backs to make it in North Dakota because they were driven by this idealism, this belief that in America, all you have to do is work really hard and you can make it. It's this kind of foundational ideology. It's false more often than it's true. But if it's 10% true, that's all they need to believe it. So that explains some of these crazy pioneers. And the Wilders, there's a new biography out of it. I haven't read it, but I read reviews of it. It sounds fascinating. They would go to North Carolina, and suddenly you would have the great locust swarms that would eat all their crops for 5 years in a row. I think one of these gets mentioned in one of the little. And they said, okay, we'll go, but there's cheap land in Oklahoma. So they pack all their belongings and go to Oklahoma. Remember, often places they're going have a few Native Americans, which they just ceremoniously push aside, or sometimes brutally push aside and move into it. It was kind of, somebody said if Laurel Ingalls Wilder were alive today, she would be a Trump supporter. I said, no! But no, then I thought about it, I said, yeah, that's probably, that was probably true. So, all right, so coming back to the present now, where are we now? Just a little bit of economic history recently. In the years between 1947 and about 1970, we had what we call the Great Prosperity in America. So now we're talking about my childhood. This makes a lot of sense. Why was America, this was kind of the height of American prosperity. How come? Because the rest of the world had torn itself apart in wars. And we sent people over here, of course. I participated in the 1995, kind of celebration of the Victory in Europe Day when I was here back then. But And so American goods, American cars, American exports, you know, we came to Europe, we came, and so those were good years. Expectations of what you should be able to make from your job, you know, got very high in those years. Ever since then, however, I mean, we're still a very wealthy country. Perhaps, I think we're the wealthiest. We're still the wealthiest country in the world. We're certainly up there. But it's not as wealthy as we were. And whenever you have a situation, this is true of every country, of people in general, whenever you have expectations up here and reality can only deliver right here, you start having resentment. The politics of resentment. And you have politicians who can play on the politics of resentment. Right? So you have the, increasingly in America we've started having a politics of resentment, of people who feel like I should be making more money than I'm making. I'm working really hard and I'm not doing as well as I can. Who do I blame? And kind of sum up, so who you blame is who have always been blamed, the people down there. It's no longer only African Americans. Now people are also blaming Latin Americans because we've had this huge influx of people who don't speak English, speak Spanish, don't speak American, and so we have this resurgence of racism. We've always had racism, but it's on the uptick and helped explain Donald Trump's popularity with a certain percentage of the population. So we have. If you look at the two political parties, we have the Democrats, who become kind of the party of women, the party of African Americans, the party of Latin Americans, the party of LGBTQ Americans, the people who have who see themselves as becoming, in the process of becoming, not the majority, but well, I guess the majority, right? I mean, whites will always be the kind of the largest minority, but whites are in the prospect of becoming the major minority. Is a phrase. Whites will be the major minority, but whites used to be the majority. So that's a real kind of shock for a number of people. So that's happening. Anyway, the Democrats want something like you have in Slovenia. They want health care for all. They want a strong social safety net, for older people, for people who are handicapped, for something like that. And then in the Republican Party at the moment, it's been taken over by basically the descendants of this pioneer spirit, who want to do away with what we call our social safety net programs, like retirement programs. They want all of that to be put into the hands of private. They don't want it to be done by the government. The head of the Republicans in Congress, Paul Ryan, has said the social safety net has become a hammock. Think about that. Social safety net has become a hammock. So and when people have hammocks, that means they just lie around. They don't really work hard. They just expect things to descend to them, I guess. And so this is what they say. And the people who are really lazy are those people down there who just want free goodies. And President Obama came in and he gave them all the free goodies, and we have to change the taxes so that taking health care away from those people and give it to the people who have deserved the money they get. So do you see how some of the ideas I talked about, from the very beginning, this kind of sense of the poor deserve to be poor, that you should pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, how you should blame these certain other that's still part of how people see economics. Not all people, as they say. I'm a Democrat myself, so Bernie Sanders, who ran in the last election, famously said, "We all want to be like Denmark." In fact, I remember Slovenia had this slogan. This was back in 1994. It was like, the slogan was, Sweden by 2000. I know you'll like that, being a Swede. So that was Slovenia's aspiration was Sweden.
Apparently it's Switzerland now.
Switzerland now. Well, kind of my aspiration too. I would like to have a country where we don't have this very high mortality rate. We have an embarrassingly high mortality rate of young mothers who die in childbirth. Or not mothers so much, but children who die in childbirth because they don't have been given it. You know, that should not happen in the wealthiest country in the world, right? So when you see the Democrats and Republicans fighting, kind of listen to their background, because you'll hear the pioneers, you'll hear the Calvinists, you'll hear the legacy of slavery in building your wealth on the backs of other people. And it's still crazy, but at least you'll kind of understand there's a history to this craziness. And just keep your eyes open, because it suddenly makes a little bit more sense when you realize that this is what we've come out of. So I'd love to hear any questions you have. I don't know how much time we have. We're probably close to the end.
We have about a half hour.
Okay, well, good. So we'll just have any questions and then adjourn. So, as this touched on, let me make sure I have all the questions you sent here. So let me make sure I touch them up. Oh, someone said, where does American tax money go? How is it distributed? Under Obama, it was distributed downwards. You know, when suddenly you're taxing wealthier people to pay for health care for lower people, that's one reason why Republicans hate Obama, why a lot of them were willing to stomach Donald Trump, is because they saw taxes going up for certain kind of members of society and people who don't deserve it going down. So we now have the highest income distribution now that we've had since the late 19th century. During the Great Depression, we kind of equalized it, but it's been moving that way ever since. And it really moves that way the most under Republican administrations, under Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, both Bushes, and now under Donald Trump. They just passed a huge tax cut in which they're cutting programs. They want to cut programs for children, needy children, and take that money and give it to to people I would say don't deserve the money. Remember, I have my own partisan views, so make sure you factor those in. So yes, but most of the tax money, overwhelmingly, the taxes go to the military, to Social Security, which is a retirement system, to Medicare, which is so all old people do have health care. We have that, and that's an immensely popular program. But certain Republicans want to cut that, and Medicaid, which is a program for poor people. So if you're really poor, you get free health care, but it's sometimes in the middle is where it gets dicey. So we passed a huge tax cut for the wealthy. We'll see if some of us are rooting for an election where we get Democrats back in control and we can reverse that and go back to Obama era distribution. Yes.
So what about, for example, Obamacare, which if you didn't buy insurance, you had to pay a fine. So basically you were paying the government, Obama's government, money to not have insurance.
Right.
So what do you think of something like this? This doesn't sound very in line with your...
Right. The individual mandate, it was called. Right. The Republicans hated the individual mandate. The Democrats said, well, if you don't force people to buy health insurance, then people will only buy it when they get sick, and insurance will go high up. So Obamacare has. They always talk about the three legs of Obamacare. Now, how do you make so? It used to be that if you had a pre-existing condition, you couldn't get health care, right? If you have cancer and you don't work for a company which gives you health care. I mean, I work for the state of Maryland, so Maryland gives all of the state employees health care. So I could get cancer and I would still get health care. But if you're an individual, if you're self-employed, if you're not employed at all and you wanted health care, you couldn't get it if you had cancer. So the Obamacare did away with that. Now insurance companies can't deny you health care. But of course, insurance companies are out there to make money. So they said the only way we can keep from raising our healthcare prices is if you force people to buy our insurance. And so that was part two of the, and then, because of course there are certain people who can't, so that's the second leg. You must be forced, the individual mandate, you must be forced to buy insurance. Then, if you, but if you can't afford to buy insurance, you'd be given money so you could buy insurance. So that make you feel. So if you're poor, I can't afford to buy insurance. Then the government would give you money so you could buy insurance. But where do you do the cutoff? You know, how much money do you have to be making before the government stops giving you a subsidy to buy insurance? And some of the prejudice against, you know, minority groups came in. So why does he get a subsidy to buy insurance, and I, who making $5,000 more, don't get a subsidy to buy insurance? So there's some clashes over there. But the whole purpose of, it must seem kind of crazy to you, right? Because in Slovenia, it's like a birthright, right? If you're Slovenian, you get health insurance. You don't have to go off, you just get it, right?
But you're paying for it. You're still paying
Yeah, you pay taxes, and those taxes come back to you in form of insurance, and everybody gets it. I mean, it's not the, so, yeah. What do you think of the idea of not being able to get health insurance because you have a pre-existing condition?
Well, basically, private insurance companies are gambling with every person. It's basically a gamble, right?
Yeah. Insurance company is a gamble, right?
So they're saying, we're betting that you're not going to get sick. So if you have a clean track record of being a healthy individual, for example, you're in your early 20s and you're a sportsman, well then maybe not a sportsman who could get into an injury, athletic injury, but a healthy young individual, and they're saying, we can afford to give this person insurance if she's willing to buy it, because the chances of him getting cancer are very low. So if you have a very morbidly obese person who is likely to die on you in the near future, you might not want to give them insurance because you lose the gamble.
So you're right, exactly. So you don't. Yeah, it's very fun. So Barack Obama, who is a very good salesperson, so the question is, so they had this mandate because they wanted young people to sign up, because young people don't get sick. You do get sick. Sometimes you do get sick, and boy, God help you if you don't have health insurance. But so they say we want young healthy people. Young healthy people will subsidize your old obese people. If you're a young person, you say, well, why should I pay for him? And they say, well, what makes you think you'll stay young forever? You go ahead.
I think we are avoiding the basic question here, namely, so when it comes to private insurance companies, we're talking about the privatization of healthcare. So the basic question to ask is it humane to have healthcare privatized so that, of course, people are forced to die, whereas they shouldn't be dying on the account of making profit, which goes to the upper echelons of the self-imposed needs having pushed through the bills that actually privatize healthcare and deny people basic service, which they actually pay. So it's all about gambling. So gambling is just the next step.
Insurance is a gamble, right?
The first question to ask is how to sort out the healthcare and to make it accessible to all people without actually commercializing it and without actually privatizing it. So the Democrats and the Republicans are actually working within the same framework here.
It's interesting. So what Obama said was that if we could, if you could just come in and sweep away what we had before and replace it with something totally new, that's what would be best. But that's not how change happens. And that's so what we did is we kind of cobbled together this government intervention with this private system. And it seems, as I say, it must seem so strange to you all, but it's like, that's how change happens. You cobble something new onto something you already have. And I mean, there are European systems. I think Switzerland, they have a combination of private and public. Slovenia, it's totally public, but you can buy extra private. Is that my understanding?
Yeah.
Right?
I was going to say, it's getting less and less strange to us, what you're explaining about
Okay.
American system, because I
Okay.
think, we're going in that direction while
Yes.
America's coming in this
There
direction.
has been certain ideas of changing our healthcare to that, to a healthcare system that would be similar to what America has. So
Yeah.
insurance for everyone.
Right.
Well, we do pay, but if you
Right.
can't afford it, the government gives it to you. And that suddenly seems like a very bad idea to our country, and what America has seems like a great idea.
Yeah, and taking pre-existing conditions into account, that's also being discussed.
Really?
Yeah, it is, it is.
And then you get into those fascinating conversations of, well, if you smoke, if you don't eat health, and then of course there are certain companies who are starting to kind of monitor people to make sure you're not smoking. And so then you get Big Brother, right? And then that whole conversation, kind of swims into it. Yeah, John. Oh yeah, let's see. You and then Jonathan. Yes, you.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. To go a bit backwards, how were people able to afford slaves? Because I read that a third of white families owned at least like a few slaves, and they cost $40,000 in today's money.
Yeah.
And I get that you got rich when you had slaves, but how were you able to afford them in the first
That's a
place?
really, really good question. And it's almost like if you were already rich, you got richer, and if you're poor, you stayed poor. Yeah. It wasn't a very interesting divide. Well, I mean, whites hated black. Let's see. Poor whites hated rich whites. You had a class divide. And unfortunately, this is a dynamic which is still happening today, but it's kind of inherited from that. So yeah, because you have a real advantage if you have slaves. You can undersell poor whites, and so basically slavery just increased gaps like that. So I grew up in the South, and I was on the top of a mountain. I was in this rich, fairly wealthy college community. My father taught up here, and it was a wealthy community. And I was surrounded by poverty like you wouldn't believe. Tar paper shacks. I mean, the deepest Appalachian poverty. And then down in the valley, there were kind of poor people. They hated us. They hated us. We thought we were above them, and they hated us. So that kind of thing. But what the rich whites could always say is they say, but you hate them worse. Right? You may hate us, but at least we're white. So playing the race card, it gets played over and over and over again. So you kind of say, why should these poor whites vote for Trump, especially when the Republicans are talking about cutting social services that you benefit from. Why do they do that? Well, and then they play what's known, with the race card, or they engage in culture wars. And culture wars are basically race wars. So we'll vote for the rich guy because they'll keep the blacks in their place. Does that make sense? So you had the same dynamic happen. Yeah, if you were poor, you couldn't afford slaves. East Tennessee, which was mountainous country, the Smoky Mountains, they actually didn't want to secede from the Union during the Civil War. They wanted to stay in the Union because they didn't have slaves, so they had no investment in the Civil War. But in the end, culturally, whiteness trumped race, to use a useful metaphor. Yeah, Jonathan.
Can any new administration reverse the decisions of the previous one? Because then it seems like, it's just going back and forth.
Yeah. Anything that Obama, there are certain things that a president can just decree. And Obama knew, Obama tried to get those passed into law because he knew if they were passed into law, then they couldn't be reversed. But when he had a Republican Congress which was resisting him all the way. For instance, he wanted to grant a path to citizenship to immigrants who were kids when they came to this country. These are the so-called Deferred Action, DACA, Deferred Action Children Act. Sonny, who Jonathan lived with us last semester, and he knew we had a Peruvian student living with us, and so that was under. If you were a kid when you came over, so these are very popular. A lot of them have become very successful Americans. They see themselves as American. They don't know the countries they came from. All they know is America. But their parents came over here illegally, and what happens to them? So Obama said, as long as they don't commit any crimes, they can get work visas and they can stay. Donald Trump just took that away from them. So now there's chaos. And these people who, as I say, they're teachers, they're doctors, they're running companies. I mean, some of them are very successful, and suddenly their status is in limbo. And Obama said you can stay as long as you don't break any laws. Or what he said is the people who round up immigrants, you have to prioritize those people over those people. There's so many of those people. There's so many criminals. Don't look at those people. Look at those people. And Donald Trump said everybody's up for grabs. And so right now we're going through a very turbulent time. So the Democratic president could come in and say, reinstitute DACA. Donald Trump is taking away a lot of environmental regulations. Another person could come in and put them right back in, because those are right. So yes, we could go up go up and down like that. So if the Republicans start passing laws, though, that's a whole other thing, because then you have to have majorities pass that. Yeah.
Just yesterday, I read that the Trump administration was planning to deregulate the financial industry again, as it was regulated in 2008 and before that in the Reagan administration. And every one of those occasions led to a big financial crisis.
Absolutely, yeah. The housing bubble, for instance,
yes,
because there's no regulation.
Do you think that the supporters of that party realize how much they're willing to sacrifice just to get richer?
That's a great question. The Supreme Court, this was one of the worst in my decisions they made, Citizens United, where they said there was no longer any limits of money that can go to politicians. And so there are billionaires whose money is flooding into certain candidates, and they really like those tax cuts, and they don't like regulations on making money. The one piece of good news, at least for Democrats, there is those were laws that got passed, and so the only way a president can't just ignore laws that Congress has passed. So the Republicans would have to pass laws reversing those previous laws. So the foundation is called the Dodd-Frank law. That's still holding, and the whole world is interested in that, because you all know what happened in 2008. I mean, Europe, Iceland went bankrupt, Ireland went bankrupt, Spain and Greece, and all this, the whole world economy froze up. Like overnight. And the laws to prevent that happening are still in place. And Trump can't just wish them away. They complain about them all the time. Rich people complain about those laws all the time, but I think we have to have them to just for world stability and U.S. stability. That's kind of good news, right?
Yeah.
From your point of view. Go ahead. Any other questions? These are great questions. Oh yeah, there you go.
So, do you think America has obligations to foreign citizens? For example, when you speak of immigrants, you speak of people. There's a part of the immigrant population that come and cross into America illegally, which by default makes them criminals. So, while they are not citizens, you know, should they have the same rights as the citizens and for the same fact, immigrants that came illegally. So.
Yeah, obviously, I don't think they should be given the right to vote, you know. But yes, no. First of all, we have a responsibility to humanity, and the Statue of Liberty, which is a big part of our civil system. So, you know, I mean, a lot of people are coming in, especially from Central America, are fleeing gang violence, so as Syrian refugees, Obama wanted to take in. Just a small number, like 10,000, I think, and even that number just created a furor, and you understand a little bit of that furor here. Yeah, we prided ourselves on being the beacon of, a sanctuary to people who need it. So, and at the very least, people need to be allowed to present their case for why they should be allowed to stay. If they're, if they face. If they were to go back, if they were to be kind of killed or, oppressed, then those are the people we have given asylum to in the past. And then those people have, as I say, it's a good economic argument because those people have contributed tremendously to the economy. Even, Donald Trump talks about, rapist Mexicans. Mexicans flood across our border and then they rape our women. Basically, it's like... That's the crime rate among illegal immigrants is a lot lower than among just like citizen Americans.
But isn't it 100% then, technically?
It's not 100. No, there are. You can always find people, and they do. Say, oh.
No, but since they cross the border illegally, they're de facto criminals.
Yeah, they are criminals. But they're asylum seekers. When they're asylum seekers, they have broken the law insofar as you're not supposed. On the other hand, if you're, somebody's trying to kill you and you, flee, what kind of criminal act is that? Technically, yeah. Oh yes.
Hello, thanks. Do you think that the Trump administration could act as a catalyst to, for the 65% of people who do not support Trump to rally around democratic ideas?
Yeah. The resistance it's come to be known. Well, I'll tell you just about kind of personal experience. So there are these groups. They call themselves huddles. All over America, these little huddle groups. They huddle together. And they're just meeting and they're saying, what can we do to save America? I mean, people are thinking in those kind of terms. And so I attend one, where I am. And the people who are coming are people who have never been engaged in politics before. I mean, some of them have, but a lot of them have not. They are housewives, they are teachers, they are ministers, they are artists. There are people who always thought you could just, you just did a good job and were a good citizen, then you voted. They all voted. But they didn't do anything more than voting. And suddenly they're knocking on doors, suddenly they're calling up telephone. They say that the energy is like nothing that political people have never seen before. And everything right now is like, so people who are unsympathetic with Trump, They have two hopes right now. One hope is the Bob Mueller investigation. It's the people who are investigating, Russia's interference in our election and the possible conspiracy between the Trump campaign to accept Russian help, and that's being investigated. Sounds like it's done very, very professionally and very systematic. And the second thing is the 2018 election. So at the end of this year, because if the Democrats take back one of the two houses of Congress, then they will be able to conduct investigations. First of all, they'll be able to resist certain laws, can't pass because the Democrats it has to be passed both sides of Congress, but they'll also be able to conduct investigations, which right now the Republicans are trying to keep control. So I'm hopeful right now. Speaking as an anti-Trump, I want to be somewhat nonpartisan, but I think that people who are resisting Trump feel hopeful right now, even though on the other hand, we're tearing our hair out as well. Yeah, so, there's a hand up there, I think. Okay, okay, you again then.
Yeah, you mentioned the investigation, but the investigation also turned out that the Obama administration illegally directed the FBI to illegally spy on Trump's campaign. Which you might justify that by saying that it was for the greater good, but still it might set a bad precedent for democracy.
Yeah, that's what people would call fake news. So,
Was that the microwave?
yeah. No, Obama, I mean, he went out of his way not to interfere with any of the investigations. I'm an Obama enthusiast, but I'm pretty sure that that was not the case.
Could you maybe talk a little about the private prison system?
Private prison system. Oh God, yeah, no. Yeah, economics of prison. Yeah, no, I think that's as bad an idea as they can, because there's this, this whole belief that business can do it better than government, because this whole pioneer spirit. So somebody said, well, that means that prisons should be able to you would be more efficient in private hands than in public hands. What has happened, unfortunately, and then Obama came in and stopped saying we're no longer sending prisoners to private prisons, so we're going to pull that out, and then Trump administration came in and reversed that. And this could be reversed again under it. But what has happened is there are these perverse incentives now you want as many people in prison as possible if you're a private contractor, right? You don't have any. So, I mean, the state has an investment in having as few prisoners as possible, but if you're a private prison, your incentive is to have as many as possible. And so the worst state for this is Louisiana, and Louisiana is there are people returned to prison for all kinds of incredibly minor offenses, because the prison, like any business, private prisons have lobbyists who will give money to politicians to vote certain ways. So it must sound pretty awful to you, does it? Mm-hmm. But the very notion of a private prison, how can you Mm-hmm. So, yes, it's not good. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this a great deal. Your questions got me thinking, and feel free to ask any questions that, as you're coming down. If you still have some things, I'll even argue with you over fake news.
So thank you for this wonderful presentation of the many faces of America, and I hope to see you again sometime.
All right, thank you.
Thank you
very much.